My name's Yash. I think Smart Club did a decent job of introducing me, but I've been debating for about 3 to 3.5 years now. And the reason I chose this topic is one, because I feel like this is one niche where you don't see a lot of workshops on. So, for example, other topics you probably have an abundance of workshops on. I just feel like this is a sort of intermediate kind of debate concept. So the purpose of this workshop, I assume that you guys have at least some familiarity with the rules of parliamentary debating, how exactly you achieve your burden, which you have to prove by the end of the debate to win the debate. So this is sort of attacking that a little bit of a niche, right? So for example, you started debating and maybe you start getting the hang of how to debate a motion, but you're not really that good at consistently winning debates or at consistently being able to make a case that you're really happy with, right? And a lot of judges probably tell you at this point that you're not analyzing enough or you're not proving enough links in your case, right? So I feel like this workshop is something that should help everyone here to at least stop making a few common mistakes, but also it just opens up a lot of space for you to think about your arguments in a bit of greater detail, maybe stop making the same kind of stock argumentation and think a little bit about how exactly I can win in different ways, right? And incentives and how you get people to work in a particular way are a really important tool even in real life, right? On the next slide, I'm going to be talking about incentives that we see in different ways and forms around us. And all of us are shaped to an extent by incentives. You just have to apply the same logic in debating to explain how that would be useful to different people in different circumstances. So starting with incentives, right? So these are just some incentives around you. Um, let's just like go one by one. What is the incentive being offered by the first picture, this limited time biggest sale thing? Can anyone just like sort of give me a hint of what you think the incentive there is? Like, what do you think they're trying to attract you with?
They want you to buy more stuff, like giving away 70% off. Like the because I know this like idea of what they're trying to do, it's very hard for me to actually like
Yeah. So the point here is, so the specific incentive they're giving you is that they're reducing the cost by 70% so that you can buy it, right? They want you to buy it. You won't just buy like you won't like randomly buy new furniture or new shoes or new clothes. They're giving you an incentive by reducing the cost of all of those things. So it becomes easier for you to justify it to your parents, to yourself, that I should spend money over here. The second one is also a sort of money-based incentive, but it's slightly different, right? It's not about them reducing the price or something. It's them sort of rewarding you by saying, if you're able to find this person, um, this is something like we're going to reward you with this much money, right? Why is this important? Because look, people have a lot of other things to do, and when you give them money for finding someone, you're rewarding them for the opportunity cost, right? They could have done so many other things with that time. Looking for someone who's lost for a couple of days is really hard. It requires a lot of investment of time from your side. You need to travel, all of that. And you need to give a reward for people to think that this is something which is worth it for me, right? So that's the incentive there. If you see the next one, they aren't even incentivizing you with money, right? But what are they incentivizing you with? It's like it's trying to sort of like give you a call to action, right? To say that like the army protects your home and protects your country, and that's something which spurs on your nationalism, right? So in that sense, it's not giving you anything tangibly, like in your hand, but it's just saying that you get to protect your country. It sort of reaches you at an aspirational level, right? Because a lot of people like have a sense of nationalism. They want to do that. I mean, I don't really support this advertisement, but I'm just giving it the concept of why these ads are likely to be so popular. The one on the right is something I'm sure like all of you have seen before. It's a Spotify ad, right? And I mean, the funniest thing about Spotify is that they're selling you the same thing. They're selling you a premium subscription, but they do it in several different ways, right? One way they do it is that you're going to get um, uninterrupted songs without ads. They do a lot of other things, right? So you can like share accounts with your family and so on and so forth. So the specific incentive here is the convenience which they're giving you, right? You no longer have to like watch ads anymore. You can have offline downloads, exactly, right? So these are conveniences which they're giving you as an incentive. They're not giving you a financial incentive. They're doing the opposite. They're taking money from you and they have to justify it in some way. So the justification is that they're making it more convenient for you. The bottom two ones are actually pretty interesting, right? So the one on the left is relaxing business and activity restrictions, right? Why is that the case? So restrictions exist for some reason, right? They don't want a lot of small businesses to die out. They want you to companies to protect the environment. like all of those sorts of restrictions exist, right? But you would relax them because you want something from them, from these companies. Maybe you want them to set up new factories, new warehouses, something to encourage more domestic activity, something to encourage spending, right? So you're relaxing restrictions on these companies so that you can get some benefit out of them in return. And the last one here is actually a picture of a passport from Dominica, which had a policy of passports for sale, right? So you can get a citizenship, and that's your incentive. Citizenships offer a lot of other things. They offer you rights, they offer you purchasing rights, all of that. And the cost to this is that they want you to invest in Dominica. So it's a pretty like unique kind of scheme where you invest a lot of money into a country and they reward you with the citizenship for that. There's similar kinds of schemes in different places. So for example, Cyprus had a passport for sale scheme where like you could have people giving a lot of money to the government and then getting a citizenship out of it, or say criminals being able to sell off this sell off the citizenship or things like that, right? So like all of these things are incentives, right? So the people won't do it otherwise, but you're giving them a reason to do it. So let's just sort of get into incentives and what we mean by them. So this workshop should hopefully give you additional mechanisms to prove why your side is successful. It should give you tools to adapt your arguments to varying contexts, right? Because a lot of times what we end up doing is just saying, look, all soldiers think a certain way, or all governments think a certain way, or all political parties think a certain way. But when you think about what the constraints on that party are, maybe it's a struggling party, maybe it's a party that's really big and wants to enter a new region, maybe it's a party which wants to attract a new set of voters. All these are different incentives which would be applicable to different extents. If I'm really, really rich, if you give me say $1,000 to do something, whatever currency you use, right, it may not be very effective, right? Because for me, maybe $1,000, like I kind of commonplace, right? I don't have to work very hard to get that much money. If I was extremely poor and 1,000 was a lot for me, that would be a significant incentive, right? So it's about thinking about how do I adapt my argument to this different context. And the final thing is analysis techniques, right? So a lot of times we just go to the like we our arguments often to the extent that if I give these people money, they're going to take that money and they're more likely to do a particular thing. Maybe they're more likely to produce local theater. Maybe they're more likely to set up businesses, etc. It's not very clear why they would do that or how exactly they would continue doing that, etc. So the degree of nuance which you add there by thinking about how effective is this, plus why exactly someone would want to do this is something that would really help your arguments. Don't mind, there's a lot of background noise. Our kids playing outside. All right. Okay, what, when, why on incentives, right? So first of all, what is an incentive? The first is it's something that motivates someone to do something that they wouldn't do otherwise. If I want person A to do something, maybe if I want them to pay my bills, if I want them to do something, they probably won't do it otherwise. I have to give them something in the bargain, and that's called an incentive. It has to be something I provide, right? So if I am if someone would anyway go to school because they have an internalized belief that school is good for them, then that's not an incentive, right? Because I'm not doing anything from my side to convince them to go to school. If they weren't going to school and I say, I'm going to give you candy if you go to school, it's a very strange thing to do. But that's an incentive, right? It's something I'm providing, probably at my own cost, so that the other person can do something which I want them to do, or that's good for them, etc. Right? When do I use them in debating? It's often to support a moral argument, right? So, for example, if it's something about you giving money to a particular activist group, right? One argument could just be that you ought to give money to this activist group because they're really good, they help out local people, so on and so forth, right? So that's independent of how useful this money is going to be to them. The second supplementary argument there is like what is called the practical argument. And at each stage of that practical argument, you need incentives, right? So in some debates, it's a supplementary argument or a practical argument to back up the principle. But some debates are just about like this incentive, right? So for example, maybe both sides want an end to the conflict in Syria. Maybe both sides want a reduction in sort of like the aggression of, I don't know, the Republicans or the Trump administration, right? So it's both. The debate then becomes which side's incentive is stronger. Should we do something aggressive right now, which is short term, or should we do something which is less aggressive but long term, right? You've probably come across a lot of debates which are like that. And the final question is why, right? Why would I do all this work to explain an incentive, do all that hard work, right? Because I often have to do a lot of thinking. how is my incentive going to look? Why is it going to be effective? Why should I do it at all? Depending on the motion, like the first stage that you have is if this action is even likely, right? So some debates you have, say, this house would fund a militia, right? It's not there. You have the fiat to say, look, at least at the very least, it's possible for me to fund the militia. In some debates, the motion directly reads, this house would incentivize XYZ, or this house would advocate for XYZ. So there, it's not even clear that you're going to be able to do this, right? So first, incentives explain if your action is even likely. And at the second stage, say once you've funded this group to do something, or once you've allowed someone a reservation education, you then show why it's effective, right? So beyond the stage of just showing why your action will happen, why is it something that's good, and why is it something that will help a lot of people involved? Incentives and interests explain the likelihood, effectiveness, and uniqueness of a particular policy. It's also about, is this incentive important, right? Because your incentive can be really likely, it can be really effective. But if it's something that the person would do anyway, it's probably not a great incentive. Or if it's something that causes them some sort of side effect or some kind of harm, it's probably not a great incentive. So uniqueness is also important because the other side will always try to say, we can achieve this to some extent on our side as well. And that's why establishing uniqueness is going to be really useful. Okay. So like 4 basic steps to build an incentive argument. If you have any questions, by the way, just feel free to drop them in the chat. I'll take them in a bit. The first is identify the interests of your actor. If you don't do this, there's no point of anything else, right? Because if, for example, you're going to, so for example, give me a TV subscription of kids' cartoons, okay, as an incentive. If I'm not interested in kids' cartoons, that incentive is never going to work, right? So the first thing that you have to do is identify what makes me excited, what gets me to act in a particular way, what gets me what would be favorable, right? If you want to get something out of me. So the first stage is identifying actor interest. The second stage, which is sometimes you can skip, sometimes you can't skip. There's a note which I've written here about when you can't skip, is about choosing what incentive, right? So suppose I want, I don't know, Smart Club to donate to record all these videos, right? I need to choose an incentive which is appropriate for Smart Club. Like if I give them, I don't know, $100 million, they would definitely upload the videos. But that's probably a lot of money, right? And they'll definitely upload videos for much less than that. So it's also about appropriate. So thinking about that sort of balance, right, between for how much of an incentive will I definitely not get them to make a change, and how much of an incentive is just overkill and too much of an expenditure from my side. So it's sort of finding the balance. The third stage is explaining the incentives action. Once I don't know, provide Yash a subscription for kids' cartoons, what is likely to happen? How is he likely to react to it, right? And the final stage is, now that I get him to act in a particular way, why do I achieve what I set out to achieve? So maybe you tried to increase the development indexes of a developing country. Maybe that's what you were going for. So you explain why changing this particular actor's incentive, maybe they're a corporation, maybe they're an NGO, maybe they're a social activist group. How does changing that influence what I set out to achieve, which was an increase in development or an advancement of a particular social issue, something like that, right? Before I move on, is there something in the chat? Uh, Okay. So there's just 2 questions here, right? The first is, how should one build a better incentive? I think we're going to cover that in a good extent in this workshop. And the second question here is, how do you go about weighing different actors in the debate and they're important? Um, I think the incentive structure of the biggest, the most important actors, what you should look at first, right? So maybe your side cannot do the most work for the most important actor, right? So for example, this could be a debate about governments and maybe how they want to achieve development. And maybe in some cases, it's a sort of conflict between 2 actors, right? So for example, to increase development and increase jobs, you might have to you might have to create a special economic zone in a place that was inhabited by, say, local residents, right? So it's sort of compromise between these 2 actors, local residents and the corporation, plus the scope of development it can bring out in the future. Is a pretty typical debate context, right? And what you have to do is think about, one, which is a more vulnerable actor, right? So in this case, the more vulnerable actor would be the community which is being displaced and may not have somewhere else to live, may have to sort of depend on state for sustenance, etc. So there's several ways you can think about which actor is more important in this debate, which doesn't mean that I cannot on my side help out like the poorest people. I then have to explain why helping the corporation and increasing jobs, increasing like local settlements, etc., also helps this actor who I care the most about. So in some debates, it's very clear who the most vulnerable actor is. So if it's a debate about, say, withdrawing troops from the Syrian conflict, both sides really care about the people affected in the Syrian conflict. But in the case of, like, say, local populations versus entering corporations, like both sides have different interests to care about. So one, think about which actor lies on your side and who you can actually help. And then think about, like, if there's a more vulnerable actor, how do I still help them? I hope that like makes sense. Okay. So yeah, just a clarification over here was that some motions need you to choose the incentive. So if it's just this house will incentivize work from home, I need to explain how I will incentivize work from home and why that would be effective. Whereas in the first one, it's pretty clear what the incentive is. That is, I would take away their citizenship and therefore get them to do something, right? Okay, I'll move on and take, yeah, all right, cool. So in terms of actor interest, right, I have to think about what is my actor likely to respond to and why will they respond, right? So this is the difference between interests and incentives, are that incentives are things which you give and interests are the concerns which I have, right? So if I'm concerned about something, if you give me that, I am more likely to do what you want. I am more likely to act in one particular way. So what I'm discussing here is the interest that all of these actors have. Obviously, this is not exclusive, right? It's not exhaustive. There are other things you can think about. So for example, apart from states, leaders, and individuals, you also have, say, celebrities, you also have artists, you also have sports people, right? Who probably don't fit directly into all these categories, but in some way they have individual interests. In some way, a celebrity is an influencer and therefore a leader, and therefore they also have um, similar incentives to what a leader has. So in that sense, you can sort of, even if it's not directly covered in the slide, you can use the intuitions given here and also relate that to other groups which aren't covered here. So in terms of the state, the states have internal incentives that are interests that are people within the state, how it deals with them, how it maintains legitimacy, all of that. And then states' interactions with other groups, right? So other states, non-state entities, etc. If you're a leader, whether you're a leader of a political party, of a social movement, of any sort of like organization, right? Like you have a responsibility towards the organization. So you care a lot about the organization and its development, blah, blah, blah. And you also care about yourself as a leader and how well you're doing as a leader, right? So there's a perception angle there as well. So how you look apart from how well you're performing. And the final thing is all of us, so individuals. And like I've written on the side as well, all of these interact, right? So states have to care about individuals. Leaders are ultimately individuals themselves, but they also lead individuals. So they have to care about them. And finally, states consist of leaders who, apart from the state's better interests, also care about their own interests, right? So individuals have their own personal and professional interests. Let's go into that a bit in detail. So in terms of the internal interests of the state, the first thing that the state has to do is maintain public cooperation. It has to ensure that people are willing to do things like pay taxes so that public works can be built, so that social welfare can be distributed, etc. If public cooperation is broken, this is something which we call as also as political capital. So cooperation mainly between the government and its citizens. And that is really important, especially in, say, times of crises when you really need your citizens to help you out, maybe make some sacrifices, etc. And therefore, it's in the interest of every government, even if it might lose out a bit of profit, to ensure that it has goodwill and public cooperation. The second thing here is resolving internal conflict, right? And it's pretty obvious why internal conflict is bad, not just because there's certain groups who would like seriously lose out, but also because you have massive losses as a state when there's internal conflict. You're far less likely to attract investment from outside. You're far less likely to be able to guarantee safety. All the responsibilities which you have as a state are compromised if you have internal conflict, right? And that's why internal conflict and resolution of that is also pretty important. And the final thing is promoting development, right? So apart from ensuring people are contributing and you're ensuring people aren't like fighting with each other, the other thing which you have to do is ensure people live better lives through the course of your tenure, right? So you're supposed to ensure that they have a better like a better wage standard. They have better options in terms of employment. They probably have better markets to choose from, so there are better choices there. They have like sort of like better life expectancies because of better health conditions. Food isn't so much of a problem, etc. Right? So these are the ways in which the state should think about. Obviously, this isn't exhaustive, but this should cover like the different ways in which the state thinks and the different concerns of the state. Okay. Then there are external concerns, right? So the first of these is dealing with other states. This includes debates where you have, say, treaties and different kinds of multilateral organizations, but also just bilateral talks, right? So, like how Nepal should deal with India, how India should deal with China, how China should deal with the US. So these sorts of bilateral engagements also. The first thing is to minimize risk of direct conflict, because obviously direct conflict is something that would really harm you. And this is a sort of like, this involves some degree of game theory for those of you who are interested in that, right? Because the optimal outcome would be that you and the other country both completely disarm, right? Both of you stop stocking up your military. Both of you just stop developing, like recruiting more and more soldiers, etc. That's the ideal outcome, and that saves like the most lives. However, you can't really trust the other party, because if you disarm and they continue to arm themselves, they become really powerful. So to mitigate that, both parties eventually just have to take up that cost and continue arming themselves. So that's like the sort of prisoner's dilemma also. And because of the lack of cooperation, a lot of states just develop armies to minimize risk of direct conflict, because just developing a standing army is often enough to mitigate the risk of direct conflict, because it's a deterrent effect, right? The second thing here is maintaining comparative advantage. I'm not sure if all of you have heard this term before. So the idea is this, right? Um, the first thing here is a sort of combative approach, right? So you think of other states as an adversary and think about the worst case where they attack you, how you prevent that. The second thing is a bit more cooperative, right? So in terms of trade, you want to like ensure that your state and whatever it's good at, right? So maybe like you have a flourishing rubber industry, maybe you're really good at producing technology, etc., right? You want to maintain the comparative advantage in those industries. So you want to ensure that those industries uh, like sort of like well stocked, they have like good supply chains, etc. Why? Because as long as those industries thrive, your country is going to be really important in terms of international trade, right? So you want to maintain comparative advantage in the trade arena as well. And the final thing here is, apart from the specific dealings which you have with other countries, you want to maintain your image, right? So this looks like international legitimacy as well as posturing. What I mean by this is, apart from just how much you're gaining through trade and how much you're able to prevent in terms of warfare, you also want to look like a country which stands in defense of human rights. You also want to look like a country that's worthy of things like donations, right? Because a lot of international organizations put conditions on the basis of that, right? Only if you adhere to certain norms, we're going to give you donations, we're going to give you aid, and so on. You also want to posture yourself as a country that is strong and therefore repels attacks without, like, countries don't even want to attack you in that sense. But you also don't want to be perceived as too strong, because countries which act like really violently often face the worst sanctions, right? So it's a lot about maintaining your image very carefully, and that's one of the biggest concerns of the state. So before I move on, what are usually the mechanisms that can get states to choose the optimal outcome, right? So I think like it's not the case that all states arm themselves. Why? Because some states have like specific bands of trust, right? So in some cases, these are codified. So for example, if you have something like the NATO, right? A lot of countries in the EU have explicit agreements with one another to prevent armed conflict. They have this idea that if one country attacks the NATO, all countries rise up together and cooperate their forces in dealing with the threat. So at that point, some of these treaties are explicitly written out, right? So you cannot attack. If you attack, these are the retaliation. These are the measures by which we'll sort of resort to. So at that point, like this, like you sometimes explicitly have these treaties, right? But often it's based on trust and on like the soft power which you're able to generate, right? So maybe like you have a lot of long-standing agreements with that country. You like you see eye to eye with like the heads of state of those countries as well as the political leadership there. You have like some sort of feasible trade relations there. So you understand that it's mutually really harmful if one of you was to attack the other, right? So a lot of these international cooperations, even if they're not codified in forms of treaties, are useful at preventing armed conflict, right? And often that's how the sort of international state of relative peace is maintained, not because everyone's altruistic and loves peace or something. It's more because it's in the best interest of everyone at that point in time to not engage in armed conflict because they probably get attacked further, right? So the idea of mutually assured destruction, at the very least, if there's not something which is codified. Okay. And apart from other states, there are also interesting motions where you deal with non-state entities, right? So these non-state entities could be, say, corporations in the state. So a lot of motions about development, about investment, deal with states and corporations. Some deal with states and religious organizations. So a motion I did very recently was about um, the state investing in religious organizations. And then you have motions about militant and anti-state groups, which I think are the most interesting debates to be had, because several different states have very different strategies on negotiating with terrorists in the first place. But also once they do that, at what point do they stop it? At what point do they stop making concessions? So all these are like pretty interesting areas of like discussion, right? So in terms of cooperation, there are a few things which corporations can give you, right? You want increase of local employment. You want to optimize the use of local resources, like maybe you have a lot of oil fields, maybe you have a lot of iron ore which your local industries aren't able to utilize fully well. Maybe your PSUs or public sector units, or basically like government companies, aren't doing really well, right? So you want to increase the amount of investment in them. You want to probably like sell off some stake in that to someone else, right? But obviously there are trade-offs involved, right? So you have to think about maintaining the environment. You have to think about also representing the local groups over there, maybe the indigenous groups. You have to think about their interests as well. Also, if you're in terms of public sector units, you still want to retain some control, right? You want to be able to dictate the way that the corporation works, etc. So that's a trade-off involved here, right? You can't just sort of cede everything to that corporation. It's therefore like a strategic engagement by ensuring that you get the best of what you want while also giving as little as possible away. In terms of religious organizations, right? You know, as a state, that religious organizations are really, really useful to people. And you can't really substitute for a lot of the things that they provide, right? So they could provide an alternate moral framework. They provide a sense of like they provide a sense of community. They give funding to the poorest people. They run things like soup kitchens. They run things like places where everyone can eat, where everyone can gather together, which a lot of states often don't have the resources or the ability to provide, right? And therefore, a lot of states don't really want to interfere with religious organizations apart from the political incentives to not do so, right? But there are reasons why not constraining a religion in any way at all would be really harmful. So one would be, say, indoctrination, where a lot of people then just stop listening to like the state and state messaging, especially on ideas of law and order, and that's really harmful, right? So you want to prevent, say, the worst strains of religion from being able to run riot. And the second thing here is preventing exploitation. So if you allow the state, if you allow religion to exist in places where people are extremely poor and don't have a lot of protections, at that point the church can sort of make them do anything, right? It can make them work for a really long amount. It can oppress them, doesn't have a lot of accountability, right? So these are the sorts of trade-offs that you have in relation to religion. Obviously there are probably others as well, but these are the biggest ones that get discussed. And in terms of anti-state groups, right? So you've probably heard of hostage crisis. If you watch the movie Entebbe, then that's something which you're familiar with at this point, right? So you want to minimize casualties, but also you don't want to give a lot of concessions, right? And the quote which I've given over here is something by Jose Maria, right? Who was the Spanish Prime Minister in the late 1990s and early 2000s, right? And while a lot of leaders want to appear tough against crime, they also are really soft when it comes to a matter of their own citizens and protecting their lives, right? And that's where the conflict really comes about. Do I continue to maintain my strong image and sort of like at the compromise of these lives, or do I buckle down, protect these people who I really care about, and maybe give some concessions, right? So these are the sorts of interesting trade-offs that come in when you're thinking about non-state actor. All right. So the difference between interests and incentives. Um, so just a sort of like technical difference between them is that if I have an interest to do something, so maybe I have an interest in maintaining a sort of fit lifestyle, um, I may just do it anyway. And I like if I'm interested in um, having a lot more friends or like having a lot more money, those are interests, right? Incentives allow me to achieve those interests. And maybe I really want to be rich. Maybe I really want to have a lot of friends. Maybe I really want to be a great debater, right? The incentives are things which would probably allow me to achieve those interests. I hope that distinction is clear, right? So if I have an interest towards doing something, it doesn't guarantee that I will be able to do it. And incentives only help me achieve what I want to achieve. And so the link between incentives and interests is that you can only incentivize someone if it's something that they're interested in. You cannot incentivize someone to do like with something that they're not interested in. Like you can make them do something they're not interested in, but the trade-off or the thing which you offer them has to be something that makes it worth it. And that's where the incentive comes in. Okay. What is the incentive structure for WLDs? Uh, wait, what's WLD, Apratham?
Western liberal democracies.
Oh, all right, all right. Incentive structure for Western liberal democracies to act in good faith. Really interesting question, right? And incentives often have a lot of soft mechanisms as well, right? Apart from the harder mechanisms. I think one soft mechanism is that Western liberal democracies want have a reputation to maintain. So they want to appear like they're defending like the liberal order or something like that. They make a lot of donations conditional on the fact that other countries respect their conditions, and also have in the past funded, say, democratic reformations of different kinds of countries. At this point, they've invested like too heavily in the creation of the democratic process in lots of different countries. So one, it's just the reputation they have of like espousing certain values, but also like the amount of baggage they have of supporting liberal ideas in the rest of the world. So that's like a sort of soft incentive. And in terms of a hard incentive, they are often in direct competition with other actors, right? So in terms of say Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, who do not market themselves according to this sort of reputation, right? They often market themselves like, look, we can get the job done. For example, China and Africa, it just invests a lot of money and it has fewer conditions on its loans as compared to what the United States has, right? So obviously, like they have barbaric conditions, right? So they maybe seize your entire port if you don't pay back the loan. But at least in terms of the entry barriers, their entry barriers are far lower. To compensate, the United States has like the Western liberal democracies have to, in fact, like be able to give them some sort of moral good reason to invest in them, maybe like to maintain the sort of like regional hegemony, etc. Right? So at that point, like that's the incentive to act in good faith even at a cost to themselves. So sure, these countries are manipulative, right? And they often act in a way like they often act however they want anyway, but they are often also the ones with the greatest media pressure to look a certain way, because like what the US does, what UK does, what France does is something that becomes like national news in a lot of places because the extensive trade connections that exist and like the sort of investments that are there, right? So at that point, like because the incredible amount of scrutiny on them, it's more likely they act in good faith as compared to them not doing so, which often does not exist, at least reputationally, on countries like China and Russia, right? Because even though they're also very large and have a lot of scrutiny, they don't have a lot of democratic scrutiny from within. Like a lot of scrutiny from inside is just shut out, and they don't have the reputation of like acting in good faith always. So in some cases that like works in their favor. Okay. Yeah. So the second part of interest, right? And this is like the interest of a leader. So leaders have organization interests, and they also have uh, they also have like the sort of like present perceptual interest, right? So I'll sort of like speed this up. I think it's taking a bit longer than I thought. But yeah, so if and a lot of motions are about choosing a leader, right? So for example, the South believes that the feminist movement should not have privileged women as its leader. And a lot of teams don't think so much about like why is the leader so important here? Like why can't I just have more women in different sort of positions, right? Why leadership? Leadership has a lot of interest at the organization level. So first is increase or sustain membership. If you're a small organization, maybe you want to keep your membership to a certain level. But in most other cases, you want to increase your membership. You want to reach different places. You want to have like more diverse membership. You want to have membership from like different kinds of people, right? So you want to have membership from hardcore feminists, of course, but you also want membership from men. You also want membership from women in like important corporate positions. You also want membership from women who are leading grassroots movements and stuff like that, right? So like different ways in which you can explain how these leaders care about increase or sustained membership. The second thing is growth of operations and finances. So no movement can actually sustain without like being financially stable, right? And I'm going to explain later how exactly movements can use money. So I won't do that now. But yeah, operations would be things like what all the movement is doing or what all my company is doing. So maybe like the different kinds of products I'm producing, the different kinds of people I'm able to access, the way I maintain a hierarchy and a distribution of work, right? So those are the sorts of things that I care about, and how exactly my company is or my organization is able to reach a lot more people and do what I wanted to do. And the last thing here is a maintenance of a track record. So apart from having more members and like growing my company, I also want to do really well, right? So like there are several reasons why I want to do really well. I want to do well because um, a lot of these organizations have metrics, key performance indicators. So for example, the amount of turnover you're able to get, the amount of say the number of say mistakes or like the degree of mismanagement in your organization, you want to minimize that, or you have like say the pure number of sales, right? All of these are key performance indicators that a dictate investment into your organization, but also dictate whether a person might want to join, right? So a lot of the reasons why you at the heart of it just want to do a really good job as a leader, or at least ensure that other people who you hire are doing a really good job, right? So those are the organizational interests of a leader, which are different from the perception interests of the leader, right? And leaders are important because they're also the point of contact for that organization with the outside world. So, for example, I'm going to continue with the feminist woman example because it's pretty useful over here. So, there are different kinds of points of access that the leader like acts as. So, the first is the local feminist movement, connection with that to the broader feminist movement, right? Or to feminists in different parts of the world, right? They see you as like the representative of that local area, and therefore you want to receive approval and you want to receive, say, funding or contributions from them as well. You want um, the channeling of, say, support, whether that's monetary support or just like notional support from the larger organization into your smaller organization as well. Apart from that, you also compete with other movements and other organizations, and therefore you compete for media space and public awareness, right? Because even if you're doing a really good job, even if the broader movement is supporting you, if people don't care, then you aren't going to achieve a lot of change from within, right? Why? Because the people you want to access are maybe constrained by like the patriarchy, maybe they don't have enough money, so they aren't going to be able to access you, so you can't make them a change, even if you have approval and all that, right? So that's why media space and public awareness is really important. And the final thing is, even if you have all of this, you can still be a really shitty leader, right? Why? Because ultimately you stand for a cause, right? And the people who you choose to affect. So maybe like if you're the leader of, say, the like a particular pride parade, right? The people who are the like most vulnerable, who probably don't even attend the pride parade because they're really scared about their identity, they care a lot about your actions as a leader and whether you're someone they can rally behind, right? So representing those people and their interests is ultimately something that leaders have to care about, because otherwise they're likely to lose a lot of support from these key people. Are leaders' interests the same as their movement's interests? So leaders have individual interests as well, right? They want to remain in the organization, they want to increase their social outreach, they want to be seen as a good person, blah blah blah. And that's the difference between their own interests and the interests of them as specifically a movement leader. So what I was talking about here is them specifically as a leader. They obviously have their own interests, right? They want to, for instance, ensure that they're seen in a good light, that people respect them specifically, although that's not specific to a leader, right? That's just all of us, and all of us care about our own reputation. um, it depends, right? Because if this is a debate about choosing the best leader, then if I have a lot of personal interest, I'm probably not a very good leader, right? However, if you have debates about like sort of like incentivizing a religious organization, you also have to think about the personal interests of that leader, right? Because that makes the deal sweeter for them. Like if personal interest didn't matter, then bribes just won't exist, right? Why? Because like people are very content in attaching themselves to the organization. So sometimes debates are idealistic, where you talk about the ideal leader and what they should stand for, but sometimes they're very, very practical, right? And very, very contextual to what people want there, and in what cases is the personal interest required so that they do what you want, right? So sometimes personal interest goes over and above the leader's interest, and maybe like you have to do a lot more to get those people on board. So I think like a good example of this is, say, if you're say a Western feminist organization and you want to get, say, a local smaller feminist group into your wing, obviously you care about like the interest of that person as a leader, but they also have personal interest, right? Because if you're able to give them a steady salary or steady stream of revenue, it's more likely that they join you in protest. If you give them protection in a legal sense, it's more likely that they're very free to spread their message, right? So at that point, the personal interests of those leaders also matter. I hope that makes sense. I think it's like very dependent on that particular debate and what is required at that point to make your point, to make your argument. Yeah. Okay. After leaders' interests, there are individual interests, right? And I feel like if you get this part of like actor interest, I think this also helps you make arguments about all other actors which I haven't been able to cover. So for example, if you understand how an individual works, this correlates to how an artist would think, how a sports person would think, how a producer would think. So all these other kinds of special individuals or individuals in specific societal roles, I think you can just make an extra link by just thinking a bit about what they care about as individuals and adding obviously what they care about in their professional goals, right? So I think this is pretty useful in most circumstances. Um, at a personal level, I care about comfort, growth, and acceptance. So comfort is like me being in my comfort zone. I want things like I want more money. I want the ability to pursue my hobbies. I want the ability to spend time with my family. I want to pursue my own individual interests, right? So I want to play FIFA or something, right? So that's really important because a lot of times when you compensate people, you also have to think about what makes the deal sweet for them. So if I'm giving you a gift voucher, I want to give you a gift voucher that is something which is useful to you, right? So like fitting within someone's comfort zone is the ideal way to get them to work for you, right? So for example, I'm sure a lot of you have applied like either registered for tournaments as a speaker or tried to get some sort of subsidy, right? And if it's too expensive, that's going way out of your comfort zone. But if you're an IA and like like the tournament is giving you a good deal, you are more likely to go for it because it's within your comfort zone, right? It allows you to do the things that you want. It compensates you well for your time, basically, right? And that's why comfort and thinking about the other person is really important. The second thing here is growth, right? Maybe I really love lounging on the sofa and playing FIFA, but I also have these like visions and dreams in mind. So I want to become like a more successful engineer or a more successful dancer, or I want to be able to pass my flying school exam, right? Or my law exam or something. So those are ambitions that people have. And if you're able to help them meet those ambitions, which aren't often expressed because most people are in their comfort zones, that's also something that's really useful. So maybe like I would like a gift of like, I don't know, a new FIFA, a new like PlayStation game. But if you give me something that is useful for my career, or something that's useful for my individual growth, maybe a self-help book, maybe something that allows me to introspect more. So those are things which individuals, like people, also value a lot, right? Apart from just their comfort zone. And the final thing is acceptance, right? So apart from all of this, like all of us live in a society. All of us are constantly like under the heel, I would say, of like social approval, right? And if you allow like a lot of the purchasing decisions that we make aren't for either comfort or growth, it's just for acceptance, right? Like you probably buy new shades or you buy like a sports jersey, not because it helps you in any way. It's just because you get to be part of a community of sports fans, right? So at that point, acceptance is also something that motivates a lot of people to make a purchasing decision. It motivates people to join a club or a group, etc. But people also have professional interests. Right? I don't think I have to explain this too much. So things like salary, you joining a job because you get a lot of connections from it, you wanting to develop skills which are not just useful at that job, but also later on in life, right? So for example, this is useful because if you make someone join a club, right, or a local organization or something, these are things that they pick up, right? They pick up like at least a basic salary, they pick up important and lifelong connections, and they pick up skills. So you can use this to explain why them joining a club is something that they want to do or something that's good for them. And on the right is probably what some of you have seen before. It's called Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And it's a bit idealistic and you probably won't use it directly in a debate. But the summary of that is that people who are like literally like clamoring for survival probably value like those basic essentials before they can value things like self-actualization, right? And this is important because if a team comes and says that we are able to give a lot of people like a sense of friendship and community, right? You can be the side that says, look, most of these people care a lot more about the essentials for survival before they can care about it. So not only do they not value things higher up in the pyramid before they can get it, they simply cannot access things like respect, self-esteem, and status without you fulfilling their physiological needs as well as the need for safety, right? This is also a sort of pyramid on how exactly the human race evolved to some extent. Like once our physiological needs were provided, you want to protect them. Once you protect them, you want to value people in your life. Then you want to have some sort of aspirations for yourself, right? But I think this is a good idea for debaters who often say things like, our side helps people self-actualize. I think that's a very bizarre thing to say. Just sort of target the specific link in this pyramid, which you're able to fulfill in people's lives. And that's a more meaningful way to explain your impact. Okay, I think that's it for interest, right? So are there any questions on interest before we move on? Well, the one about building better incentives is something which we're going to do over here, right? So, and this part is going to be a bit extensive, so it's pretty useful if you sort of take notes of this. So the first thing which people provide is money, right? And the thing with this is you have to explain this in some detail. One, what is the specific way in which I'm helping people? So sometimes it's a tax break, sometimes subsidy, sometimes the grants. Notice all of these are quite different, right? A tax break is a sort of relief from something that they would otherwise be charged for as a state function, right? So states can only give tax breaks in a limited amount, and otherwise, like most citizens do have to pay taxes. Subsidies are basically the government making something cheaper. So it's sort of reducing the price of a commodity for someone else to buy. And grants are a different category where you are literally just giving money. So probably you're giving money to a researcher such that they produce a particular kind of drug or such that they divert their attentions towards, say, COVID research, right? So these three things are structurally quite different, but they may be used by teams sort of interchangeably, right? And the reason you shouldn't do that is because one, it depends on what is the most useful for these sorts of companies or actors, blah, 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 but also what is the most applicable. So it would be funny if I said, I'm going to give tax breaks to an artist, right? Because they don't have a lot of taxes, but what they would make a lot of use of is a grant. Similarly, subsidies would be very useful to say local, like say farmers, so that they can like buy seeds at like really cheap rates, etc. Although for grants, you need a sort of justification on the basis of like the certain committees to approve grants. So subsidies are probably more appropriate than grants in that case. And tax breaks are probably the most relevant to people who pay a lot of tax. Typically corporations, I mean, they should pay a lot of tax. So corporations or say people who are living in some sort of like a slightly higher wealth bracket who often have like a surplus tax or sin taxes, etc. Right? So thinking about what exactly I am doing and what exactly would help this actor the most is pretty important in terms of money. So I think so. For instance, if you're talking about like an artist, right? You often give artists grants A on the basis of like where they come from. So you want to say incentivize traditional art or rural artwork. So it's you have quotas for what kinds of art you're looking out for. Second, obviously, you have some performance metrics. So the best artists, maybe over a span of time, maybe they've like been able to like they've been very successful in one small area but not been able to make it big otherwise. So it's often a performance metric. It's often like you deciding what you want to like what kind of art you want to see more of, etc. So like those things are based on committee approvals, right? It's also on the basis of what art is deemed to be like something that you really require, right? Apart from the style of the art itself and the producer, also like you would want to give grants to art which glorifies say a freedom struggle, right? Something like that, right? It depends on the nationalistic and contextual needs of governments and whoever else is like providing these grants. So grants are always situated in the the person who's providing that grant, right? You have to think about that. Like grants don't come out of thin air. They come out because the person who's providing the grant wants is trying to encourage you to do a particular thing. Notice that grants don't have to be conditional though. So just because they provide a rural artist a grant, it doesn't mean that they won't just make the most commercialized form of art because they want the most money, right? You can't assure that. So that's the sort of issue with grants. Like in some cases, these monetary incentives can be conditional. In other cases, they're not fully conditional, but they are more likely to yield those outcomes than would happen without those incentives. The second incentive is not based on money, but it's membership, right? So it could be citizenship of a country, it could be religious affiliation, it could be multilateral organization. So, for example, you're choosing to include or exclude a country from um, I don't know, the NATO or the United Nations, etc. Choosing to include or exclude people in a religious context. So, for example, you have motions about excluding people from religion in case they are part of criminal organizations, right? And the final thing is like the other thing is citizenship. So sometimes there's a debate about revoking the citizenship of people who've been involved in crimes abroad, like basically the ISIS UK kind of debate, right? Okay, there's a question about auctions on something absurd which adds no value. I think that's a very good question, right? Why? Because the problem with grants to some extent or with any form of incentive is that I cannot 100% assure that it will be used in a good way. So it's kind of the same as your parents giving you pocket money, right? They don't give you a bucket list of things that you can use that pocket money with. But why is this actor unlikely to misuse this money, or auctions on something like totally absurd is something which is your homework, right? So you have to do work to mitigate, like, and explain why it's most likely that this actor uses the money in a good way or something that is useful to the society or the community or the art itself. There may be a small chance that they use it on whatever they want, and sometimes it's not a terrible thing, right? So, for example, a lot of teams argue, like say in UBI debates, that uh, when you give universal basic income to people, they would use it in very specific ways, right? They would buy rations for themselves. I mean, that's not necessary, right? People can use UBI in whatever way they want. And I think like it's useful for you to say that we're not going to have too many restrictions. Anyway, they have a lot of restrictions. And apart from the constraints that operate on them, if they still think that like they should spend anyway, then anyway, like people above the poverty line spend on whatever they want, and therefore it's unfair to make that restriction. So you can't 100% eliminate absurd uses of your incentive, but at least you can explain why your incentive will be used in the way that you want it. Okay. There's another question just before I move on. So it's the question on if our model's funding process depends on grants or interest-based donations. Okay. Funding is likely to materialize. Yeah. So okay, I think the first step about an incentive is that it rarely comes out of altruism. It always comes because, see, because if an art collector is supporting another art collector, right? Um, it's a personal cost that that person is incurring. Why will I incur a personal cost unless I think that A, it's worth it, or B, I think that money is going to come back to me eventually. So, for example, when a VC invests in a small startup, they do it not because of altruism or they really love those people, right? They do it because they expect this company to grow and then give that money back, like once they acquire that stake and once a company becomes large enough. Similarly, you can analyze this art collector in two different ways. The first is in a purely materialistic sense, to say if like the art collector has an incentive to do this because smaller art collectors, especially like if they're carefully chosen, right? If you realize that okay, this kind of art is going to become really really big, you fund it and then you can gain a lot of money from it. And art collectors are always keen to expand their range and improve their like the kind of art that they're dabbling with, right? So obviously art keeps evolving and therefore art collectors have an incentive to remain relevant so that they a profit off of it, but also they're extremely relevant to that particular time. So that is directly thinking about their own monetary benefit from that. But also you can think about art collectors and what they're told, like what like the public scrutiny on them. and why it would look really terrible if an art collector just squandered a lot of their money and didn't support local art, and the value of public pressure, blah, 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 right? So either you explain a direct benefit to them from doing this, or explain why they would do this to serve their image or their reputation, or to further their own personal goals, because certain kinds of art is like all art collectors want to, for example, be seen as patrons of very diverse kinds of art, or be the kind of art collector who everyone wants to look at favorably, right? So those like competition with other art collectors is another metric. So that's the way you could explain compared to just saying, oh, they really like it, so they're going to do it. Okay. And the third kind of incentive which you can give, am I audible? Yeah, okay. The third kind of incentive you can give is mitigation, right? I just chose the word mitigation because it ensures all three start with M, and that's easy to remember. But yeah, like mitigation is different from money and membership. It's basically something bad would have happened. Maybe you would have had to pay a lot of taxes. Maybe you would have gone to jail. Maybe you would have had like some sort of hefty legal damage, right? And governments or some other party mitigates that damage so that you would do something in exchange, right? So, for example, they reduce your sentencing if they're the judicial system. This typically happens in case of, say, spies who are caught from outside. You reduce their sentencing if they rat out on other people. Obviously, like this has a lot of ethical issues, and this is a huge debate about whether this is something that's good and should be encouraged. But this is what happens, right? They give you the financial, they give you this sort of like legal incentive so that you are providing information in exchange, right? A lot of spies don't provide it anyway, but this at least like has helped a lot of like information come to light. The second thing is relaxed restrictions. So the one we talked about right at the start about environmental restrictions and say zoning restrictions, right? And whether it's fine to waive those if it ensures that more companies can come, more companies can have real estate projects, etc. So it's a trade-off there about whether like a slight probabilistic damage to the environment or to some people living down there is okay if I'm able to get benefits of development at least in the short term, right? Then there's immunity. So you promise that they will not be prosecuted again as long as they provide some form of information, etc. Right? And the Spotify example was one of convenience, right? So I would probably have to listen to a lot of ads, or I may have like in another case, I may have to like you have a lot of uh, like say someone's offering you a bribe at the license registration office, right? To say that you can skip the queue if you take the slightly more expensive licensing option. That's offering you convenience, and in exchange they want money from you, right? And the final thing is control. So like often governments probably offer control of an administrative region which is probably what a particular state or territory want. A lot of say negotiations with say armed groups or armed militias often offer them control in exchange for a reduction of hostilities, right? So these are the different kinds of incentives, not exhaustive, but this is a pretty broad way of categorizing the different ways in which you can make people act in a particular way. Okay. Yeah. So let's just like go into detail on how each of these incentives even works, right? Because this would really help you to develop that explanation, right? Yeah, sure. I'll do more on control. Okay, before I move on. Yeah. So the point here is a lot of say armed groups aren't fighting just because they want more money or they want more prestige. They actually literally want control, right? And say a lot of what do you call it? A lot of states when they split into two different states often split for this reason, right? The concession is that you give the rebelling territory control over a region, and in exchange for that they would stop the conflict and they would stop the violence, right? So that's what I mean by a mitigation in the form of control. Like you as a sovereign state are sort of saying that okay, I'm making this compromise, I'm going to give you control over this region or over like this sort of like over these finances, or maybe you're making a concession that like at a university level that you would allow students to decide a particular kind of policy, right? Either way, some groups demand control as part of their negotiations, and therefore control is something that they take, and in exchange they stop hostilities or they stop violence, etc. So for example, this is pretty useful also in debates about colleges and students and like the kind of curricula which they would use, because control is something which ultimately students want over their own sense of expenditures, over their own curricula, etc. Right? I hope that makes sense. If not, like, sure, you can take it up later. Okay, the first thing to explain here is money. I'm sorry this is going on for a bit. Uh, I hope you guys can stay for a little longer. Hopefully, I'll wrap it up within about 10 minutes. Okay, the first thing is money, right? And a lot of teams just tend to say that if I give people money, they're more likely to act in a particular way. And the important thing which you can do is think about how money affects different people in different ways. And apart from whatever I've given here, you also can think along different axes, right? So how does money affect me in the short term? How does it affect me in the long term? How does it affect me individually? How does it affect my family? How does it affect my business, etc. Right? So again, thinking about the individual and what all I care about, and how does it, how can I pump my money into each of those? So at an individual level, if I'm extremely poor, money can assure survival, right? So in debates about, say, um, uh, ensuring that like increasing religious influence in extremely poor areas, I think an argument which you could make in support of that is that the money which churches like can accrue from their followers everywhere and through televangelists, etc., and then give to people who are followers of that religion, at least assures them a basic sense of survival, which is more important to them than any other thing which like the government can provide to them, right? So for certain groups of people, survival is what is assured by the provision of certain find 2 to 3 meals a day, and they can at least afford basic medicines, etc. The second thing here is probably for people who are slightly above the like desperate poverty level, right? There's this data which has money at least for the basic essentials, but doesn't have enough to plan out beyond like the next month or the next year, because they still live to some extent from paycheck to paycheck. They still work like a couple of jobs, etc. And providing them money gives them financial security, which allows them to work like or do whatever they want for a sustained period of time without thinking too much about other things. So, for example, if I give, like in the classic debate about whether household helps should get a salary from the state, it gives them financial security so that in case they want to leave that household, they aren't constrained by it anymore, right? So a lot of times when people don't leave relationships, it's because they don't have financial security. Money can provide them financial security to at least make the kinds of decisions that they want. And the third thing is opportunity cost. So, which is what I kind of like a good example of this is sort of like when you choose to attend a tournament or you choose to judge at a tournament, or you choose to give your time to a particular function, right? It should be worth your time. And that's essentially what opportunity cost is. So it's not about survival, it's not about financial security. It's just about, is that person going to think that it's worth it? And opportunity cost is you trading off the time that you're putting in, the things which you could have done otherwise. Maybe you have to lose out in some way on like other opportunities. So whether this like trades off against all of that is the opportunity cost evaluation, right? And that's how money can like really help people. And money also helps organizations, right? And I feel like this is another area where teams lack a lot of explanation. So how do you explain how an organization benefits from money? The first is equipment, right? So if we're talking about terrorist organizations and why they want money, it could be them buying more guns, um, them like buying better protective gear, etc. Similar things for the army. If you're talking about like say a local shelter, equipment means like say increasing their capacity in terms of like the number of seats they have, the number of beds they have. For a hospital, it could be the medical equipment they require, etc. Right? And like lab coats and PPEs, etc. In terms of outreach, that also requires money. Why? Because a lot of media is paid. You need to pay for like your article or your feature to be present in like the front page of newspapers, or for example, your product to feature on the first page of an e-commerce website, etc. Right? Plus, like on the radio, etc. Anything which allows you to put your name out there often requires you to put in money. therefore money can help an organization reach a lot of different people, right? The third thing here is recruitment. So obviously, if I have more money, I can put that directly into wages. So not only can I retain like the people I already have by giving them some bonuses or an increase in their salary, I can also get different people, which distributes the work better. It increases my efficiency directly, right? And the final thing is development. So if I have more money as a hospital, I can like sort of like ask for better researchers who can then allow me to diversify into a different area of healthcare, right? If I'm a research lab, then having like more money can allow me to purchase artificial organs so that my development is more cutting edge. It can allow me to purchase more medicines so that I can do a lot more experimental research there and do more things with the like with the kind of organizational role that I have, right? So money helps organizations in a lot of different ways, and this is the kind of thing which you should think about as well. Okay. Apart from money, the second thing which we talked about is membership, right? For a country, if you're the member of an international organization, you get like three main things, right? The first is just support in numbers. So the fact that you're part of, say, the OPEC or the ASEAN means that you have like these countries to vouch for you in say bigger organizations like the United Nations, etc. Because you have at least something in common with them and you are able to convince them a little better, etc. And therefore you're able to get support in numbers for any kind of policy that you eventually want to pass. The second and really important thing is contingency, right? Because if you're part of an organization, which like all these membership groups often have membership costs, and a main function of those membership costs is contingency measures, right? So if a country suddenly needs a bailout or suddenly needs like donation because it had a lot of floods or something, at that point, being part of these organizations is useful because they have these structures to help you out, right? So either you have collected funds to help you out in contingencies, or you have the trust of individual countries to help you out and give you aid packages. And the final thing is soft power, right? Which is different from support in numbers because you're able to form, say, personal connections with those leaders and the kinds of policies that they stand for, etc., which is more likely to help you and in an international standpoint, right? So when you require, like, say, notional support for a few things, apart from like the support in numbers, which is required to pass policies, soft power is something that is acquired once you engage a bit better with different countries, when you have trade relations with them, when you have a mutual sort of quid pro quo, right? You're giving them something, they're giving you something. The respect for you increases. It's more likely that, say, your coming to power has like a lot of international support for it and stuff like that. Right? Soft power is pretty useful because they're more likely to welcome companies from your country into their country for more likely to sign deals with your country, etc. Right? Soft power is a precursor to a lot of economic relations, a lot of political relations, etc. Membership also helps people, right? So if I was, this is more about, say, uh, like an individual person joining maybe a church or local club, etc. The first thing that you get is services. So maybe there are services which are only exclusive to members. Maybe if you're part of the church, you get access to a community lunch every week. You get access to the common prayer hall. You get access to some form of education, etc. Right? So those services are probably open only to members. And some people would like purely join a church or purely join a local club because they get these services. So maybe you're joining a local club because you love playing table tennis, right? And being part of the local club allows you to play table tennis. So that's a service which you're joining that organization for. The second thing which you join an organization for is peers. I don't think I need to explain this too much, but not just because it helps you out because you have other people similar to you, you can connect with them, but also because like peers can be really helpful in times of need. The third thing is meaning, right? Maybe I join a church because I want to see something beyond my current reality. I want to sort of have a connection with like the higher being or something like that, right? People have their own personal growth kind of incentives connected to joining a particular group or a cult or something like that. And those cults or groups can give them meaning. And the final thing is recreation, right? Maybe I join a local sports club because I really enjoy the game. Maybe I enjoy a fan club because I like having support in my favorite activity. I get like a sort of dopamine hit whenever I think about it. So there are also recreational needs which people have and they get satisfied through membership. Obviously, this depends on what I'm getting membership into. So you can't probably use all of these benefits, but whichever ones are the most relevant. Okay. And the final thing here is mitigation, right? So at a personal level, when, for example, I offer someone a citizenship, they get rights, right? They get a legal right to, for example, buy a house there, or they get some protection, they guaranteed a lawyer, etc. So when I give people citizenships, they like value the rights that they get off from that citizenship. If I'm reducing someone's prison sentence, what they get there is freedom, and it's pretty intuitive why a lot of people value freedom, to have time with their family, to be able to do what they want, as compared to being under like really restrictive